I think the second week of the war, they targeted our broadcasting house. Some of my colleagues were actually calling their relatives, like farewell to them. Oh, I think I can't make it.
The most important issue is macroeconomic stability.
Middle East conflict.
The war on Iran.
Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Strait of Hormuz.
As the US-Israeli war on Iran continues to dominate headlines across the globe, growing concern is now centered not only on the human toll of the conflict, but also on its widening economic impact.
The energy crisis, the food crisis, the cost of living.
Uncertainty is now the new normal.
When the Strait of Hormuz is strangled, the world's poorest and most vulnerable cannot breathe.
The blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a major gateway for oil, gas, and fertilizers, is disrupting global trade, energy supplies, and food systems.
The conflict is already being felt everywhere.
Most of the fuel and related products, including fertilizer and other items, they come from that region.
Inflation is lingering in many countries, and the cost of food and fuel continues to rise. Economists warn that if these disruptions persist through 2027, with oil prices remaining above $100 a barrel, the world could face a global recession.
Global recession.
Across Africa, the impact is severe and worsening by the day, and part of the reason is structural. Roughly 80% of African countries are net importers of refined fuel. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa imports nearly 80% of its fertilizer, relying heavily on supply chains from the Middle East. So when supply from that region is disrupted, the effects ripple very quickly across African economies. Fuel becomes more expensive, raising the cost of transport. As fertilizer becomes scarce, agricultural yields could decline, affecting food supply.
This is a planting season. If you don't apply fertilizers, then definitely the harvest will be low by any standard. And when the harvest is low, also, of course, the prices go up.
With severe disruptions persisting,
The United Nations has warned that prolonged disruption through the Strait of Hormuz could push millions more people into acute hunger and extreme poverty.
32 million people are pushed into poverty, and 45 million more people will face extreme hunger, especially among the world's most vulnerable populations.
Across Africa, governments are already responding with measures ranging from fuel subsidies and energy rationing to alternative fuel programs, while prioritizing fuel supplies for critical sectors. Cassie Kevin is a Rwanda-based journalist. She now tells us how things are unfolding in Kigali.
The government was very deliberate to ensure that diesel prices remain low as a measure to cushion the public. Now, the government is calling on the public to use public transport even more, and we have seen dedicated bus lanes being expanded. Now, these bus lanes were introduced late last year, but now they're being expanded to different key corridors across the city. This is to ensure faster movement of the buses, is to ensure easier movement, especially during peak hours, and also people who have about 7 passengers in their private vehicles will also be given priority in these bus lanes, just as a way to encourage people to carpool. The disruption to global oil supply is seemingly triggering a faster move towards e-mobility. Now, the Ministry of Infrastructure recently directed all public institutions to ensure that 30% of newly acquired vehicles are electric.
The effects are also being felt in the aviation sector. According to data from the International Air Transport Association for the month of April, global jet fuel prices have nearly doubled since the conflict began. The report indicates that fuel now accounts for between 30 and 55% of operating costs for some African airlines, far exceeding the global average of 20 to 30%.
Because of fuel surcharges, which have increased between 20 to 50% across all airlines, we've seen an increase in pricing anywhere from 20 to 30,000 up to 100,000 in the price of tickets. This basically means that people are rethinking their travel.
Air traffic in the Middle East has dropped significantly since the conflict began. At Dubai International Airport, for example, which is one of the world's busiest hubs, passenger traffic fell by nearly 2/3 in March, and some of that traffic is now being redirected through African hubs.
Ethiopian Airlines benefited from this. During that time of the peak of the fighting, of course, it was having the challenge of jet fuel. That's the time it was really gaining and taking over routes that were being done by some of the Gulf airlines.
Passengers who would normally transit through the Middle East from Africa to elsewhere, and from elsewhere to Africa, it's shifted it toward Ethiopia and Kenya, because between those two, they can connect from Africa to the rest of the world and from the rest of the world to Africa.
Here it's important to note that about 22% of intra-Africa traffic transits via hubs that are outside of the African continent. This disruption, therefore, opened African hubs to be seen as transit points for passengers traveling between Africa and the rest of the world.
The pressures also being felt across global shipping routes. With disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz and part of the Red Sea, more cargo vessels are being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding time and cost to global trade. So both air and sea transport routes across Africa are seeing increased activity. But can that momentum be sustained once stability returns to the Middle East? Initiatives like the Single African Air Transport Market, designed to open up airspace across the continent, could help African countries build on these gains beyond the current crisis. But that will depend on infrastructure, coordination, and the ability to move passengers and goods efficiently across African markets. The reality, though, is that most African countries are still focused on exporting crude oil, which is processed abroad and sold back to the continent as refined fuel. That gap is what drives higher costs and vulnerability to global shocks. When refining happens elsewhere, African countries become more exposed to disruptions in shipping, pricing, and global supply chains. Closing that gap will require significant investment, more refineries, better storage, and stronger transport systems to move fuel and other products reliably across African countries. Beyond markets and prices, the lives of millions of African students and workers across the Middle East have been disrupted. Many have been forced to flee back to their home countries for safety. One of them is Hussein Hassan Kamal, a Kenyan journalist who lived in Tehran and worked for Iran's State Broadcasting Corporation before fleeing the country.
I think the second week of the war, they targeted our broadcasting house. Some of my colleagues were actually calling their relatives, bidding like farewell to them. Oh, I think I can't make it. You couldn't think about what you are leaving behind. Your money is in the bank. No one really cared so much about that. You are just worried, am I going to get home safely?
Hussein and others were supported by the Kenyan government to return home. Back in Kenya, he says rebuilding life after such a sudden departure would not be easy, but the joy of being reunited with his family matters more.
Also seeing my kids waking up for school.
Can Africa reduce its heavy dependence on imported fuel and fertilizer? ECA's Executive Secretary, Claver Gatete, says the continent already has many of the resources and market opportunities needed to begin closing the gap and reducing that dependence.
Dangote has a refinery that has the capacity of 650,000 barrels per day, working at full capacity, and also has the fertilizer plant, but only that has been exporting outside. But there is an advantage that this time, combining with Morocco, both of them can be able to cover the African continent. But it takes time to reorganize and be able to support our member countries. There are other factors also which are very critical. One of them is the logistics and infrastructure. In as much as we are trying to implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the logistics is still a hassle, because you may have the fuel, but how do you take it to many countries if the logistics are not as good as expected? So there are still challenges, but it's an opportunity. First of all, when you have a crisis like this, the most important issue is macroeconomic stability, because it brings in the inflation, the currencies lose value. Currently, you have 31 currencies that have already depreciated. And that causes a lot of problems, because the amount of money that you used to pay for the debt has now increased because your currency has depreciated. And anything that you want to buy from outside, it also becomes more expensive. So that is a cost that is short-term in nature. The other one is also how to fix the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which has been there for a long time. We talk about it, but the free movement of goods and services and putting infrastructure in place, that will help. That if there is a shock, then it can be able to get whatever product across to many countries. So you are producing it, but you can't process it. And that's why Dangote wants to more than double what he has in terms of processing. So that way then you can have more refined fuel that you can supply across the continent. He has the capacity for that. But at the end of the day, even if you are importing, at least you have a buffer because you are producing that. Fertilizer, we also have the capacity. Nigeria and Morocco alone, both combined, have enough phosphates. Actually, Morocco has the highest phosphates, but there are other ingredients that you also add, meaning both of them can cover the whole entire continent. Then what matters is how to trade from one country to another. In the case of the refined petroleum, you need some pipelines going to the east, going to the north, going to the south, so that you can easily distribute. So there's quite a lot of logistics that are needed, and also cooperation from member countries. Jet fuel can also be produced. So there are some that can be done. You can never be 100% self-sufficient, but at least would have enough for the buffer. This is actually the right moment. As ECA, we are now targeting 94 different regional value chains, including those in agriculture, in minerals, and other sectors. By doing that, it means that most of the products, you don't have to get it from outside. But of course, trade is always trade. You always look for something that's cheaper. And that one will continue. But at least if something hits, then we are okay.
When a crisis of this nature happens, do you think it speeds up processes on the continent?
Of course, nobody likes a crisis, but we need it sometimes, because now talking to member countries on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and how to implement it, it becomes much easier because they have seen if you don't do it, what is likely to happen. Now on air transport, harmonization, convincing countries, some of the countries was very difficult. Talking about integration in terms of the transport and other infrastructure that you put in place would be very difficult unless there is a shock. So the shock is not good, but it helps you to build long-term sustainability of movement of goods and services, and hence sustainable economic development.
Strengthening Africa's long-term resilience is now a matter of urgency. The continent has had to navigate repeated global shocks, from the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed heavy dependence on imported pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, to the Russia-Ukraine war that disrupted global grain and fertilizer markets. And now the conflict involving Iran is once again exposing vulnerabilities in energy, trade, and supply chains. Maybe now is the time for Africa to capitalize more seriously on those areas where the continent already has comparative advantages, from natural resources and industrial potential to market size and a growing labor force. Reducing dependence on external supply chains should no longer be just an economic ambition. It should now be treated as a strategic necessity. If you are interested in some of the policy recommendations around these issues, a joint report released in April by the ECA, the African Union Commission, and regional partners explores many of them in greater detail.